Greetings. I am Walt Bauer, and I'd like to welcome you to the Human Development Institute's first fall webinar. We welcome all the participants who are joining us online. Our presenters will provide an opportunity for questions today, and we welcome questions from all of our participants. Please type your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box. Please use the chat box for technical questions. You are joining the webinar on mute, and there is not a participant video in the webinar room. We have live captioning for this webinar today. To turn on the captioning, click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, and then click Show Subtitle. Please take a moment at the conclusion of the webinar to complete our brief evaluation. The evaluation will be sent to your email address after the webinar. It is really helpful as we plan for upcoming webinars. Should you have any questions about CEUs, you can contact me. My email address is walt.bauer@uky.edu. Again, that is Walt, WALT.BOWER@uky.edu. The title of the webinar today is The Intersection of Universal Design and Landscape Architecture, Creating Inclusive and Engaging Outdoor Spaces. It's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce our speakers today. We have with us Jordan Feimeister, is a lecturer in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Kentucky. We also have Ryan Hargrove, is an associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Kentucky. We also have Joe Howell, is a park designer with the Lexington Division of Parks and Recreation. I'm now going to turn it over to our presenters. Jordan?
Well, Murphy's Law is alive and well because I have a leaf blower and the train was just going by outside. So hopefully my audio is okay. Bear with me.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
Okay,
we
good.
cannot hear it.
Good.
Loud and
well,
clear.
Thank you so much, Walt. It's really an honor to be able to join the Human Development Institute seminar series this fall. Thank you so much for inviting us. And I really appreciate Ryan and Joe joining me today. Because they're going to make this presentation even better. So I'm going to do a little bit of read 'em and weep. I wasn't sure, Walt, if we needed to review learning objectives, but in case we do, our goals today are to help identify key concepts of universal design and accessibility in outdoor spaces, understand the role of landscape architects in the design of outdoor spaces, and then help you all discover some examples of inclusive and engaging outdoor spaces with a focus on children's play environments. This is going to be the basic flow of the presentation. I'm going to start with universal design. Ryan's going to take it to talk a little bit about landscape architecture, and it'll come back to me and Joe, and we're going to talk a little bit about my teaching and some examples of my professional practice work, and then really the focus will be on Joe's great work with parks here in Lexington. And then we'll conclude with some future challenges and opportunities. So my first question, the goal here is to help talk a little bit about what is universal design. So I'm focusing in on universal design, which is naturally a little bit more broad. I'm going to come back later to issues of accessibility, which are legally defined requirements as they relate to landscape architecture. But starting here, the image I hope is helping you to understand that universal design is designing for everyone. It's an intentional and inclusive approach to the design of everything from products to outdoor spaces so that they can be used and enjoyed by people with disabilities. It recognizes that our abilities and our proficiencies change over time. So you can see in this picture, there's a woman, there's a mother pushing a stroller, and there's some people who are walking with canes as they get later into their life stages. The beauty of universal design is that the end result, anything ranging from a food processor to a user interface on a website to a building or a public plaza, is easier for everyone to access, to use, and to enjoy. So I imagine that some of you out there have a disability or know a person who is impacted by a disability. Here are some statistics that help drive home just how disability impacts all of us. So in the upper left, you can see the map that says that 61 million of adults in the United States, or 26%, have some type of disability. Directly below that, you can see the prevalence of the different types of disabilities broken down into really broad categories. So you can see that 13.7% of people with disabilities face mobility issues, 10.8% are impacted by cognitive disabilities, 6.8% are unable to live independently, 5.9% have difficulty with hearing, 4.6% have vision impairments, and 3.7% have difficulty with self-care. Over on the right, you can see here in Kentucky, we far exceed the national average. We have more than a third of adults in Kentucky are impacted by disabilities. And you can see in the bar graph there that they follow a similar pattern in terms of the national trends on the types of disabilities that adults are facing here. A little later in the presentation, I'll come back to statistics related more specifically to children, which is going to help facilitate our discussion of playgrounds. So I like this definition of universal design. This comes from the Center for Universal Design at North Carolina State University's College of Design. Brian has a connection there. But I highlighted what I really appreciated about it. I think it broke it down very simply, that it simplifies life for everyone, that universal design is really, the goal is to make things as usable by as many people as possible. And that ultimately, universal design benefits all people of all ages and all abilities. It's often defined by 7 key principles highlighted here. And the first is equitable use. So we want to avoid segregating or stigmatizing people. Second, flexibility in use. So the example of being able to use scissors by a right-handed person or a left-handed person. Third, simple and intuitive use. So no unnecessary complexity. So the little girl is just intuitively knows, she doesn't have to know how to read. She knows that she can figure out a way to get help for someone who needs it just by the design. Perceptible information comes with something like the home button on a phone screen, or things like tactile warning strips at a crosswalk. The next one is tolerance for error. So the example here, we're trying to illustrate minimizes hazards and errors. So we care a lot about health, safety, and welfare as landscape architects. And the example here, there are redundant safety measures and something like a nail gun to make sure people stay safe. 6 is low physical effort. I'm sure all of you are familiar with lever door handles. It doesn't require the ability to grip in order to get yourself in and out of a structure. So that's really helpful for everyone. And then last is size and space for approach and use. Another one that we focus on a lot in our profession, because there are minimum dimensions that would allow someone traveling to be able to pass, you know, if you're in a wheelchair, passing through something like a turnstile mechanism. So our profession is the American Society of Landscape Architects, and they took those 7 principles and they figured out how to apply them to the work that we do. So they've translated them into a series of principles to guide the planning and design of public spaces. So first, accessible. So accessible to all, that all public spaces should work for everyone. Next, we want sites to be comfortable. Safety is important, but even more important is a sense of belonging. Everyone should feel comfortable and able to engage as they would like in a space. The next one is participatory. This relates more to trying to find ways and opportunities to go co-design with people with disabilities, because I can't know the challenges that someone who might be using a walker or a wheelchair faces. And so it's really important to get their ideas and a clear understanding of their needs. There's the ecological. We all know that exposure to nature, or learning more and more, that the exposure to nature in green spaces is proven to provide mental, cognitive, and physical health benefits for people of all ages and abilities. And so universal design should really strive to provide these opportunities throughout the built environment, with the added benefits that they foster ecological resilience, support biodiversity, and do a lot of other wonderful things for our environment. Next, we want spaces to be legible, clear, understandable designs. Where can you go? How do you get there? Providing things like multi-sensory signage and signals, a clear delineation of spaces and intended uses, all make things legible to people. Multi-sensory is talking about incorporating design elements that can be accessed through the different senses, providing an alternative system of navigation in a built environment that's often dominated by the visual. And so things that you can listen to or hear or touch or textural cues can help you get around and navigate a site and understand what's going on there. Next is predictable. So we want our designs to be clear and consistent and understandable, and we can create design cues that give predictability for all ages and abilities, helping to improve the overall comfort and safety of a site. And last but not least is walkable, traversable. And this is kind of more of a systems kind of holistic view of how we design our communities. Distance is a real limiting factor to people with disabilities. And so communities that are designed to support different modes of mobility, like walking and biking through really generous sidewalks and path systems to bike lanes, and those systems connecting a diverse set of amenities like shopping, restaurants, healthcare, other things, and cultural opportunities, all of those kind of put together, those communities designed in that way can allow people to live independently for a much longer period of time. To wrap up this quick introduction to universal design, I just wanted to talk about briefly the concept of the curb cut effect. This term was coined by disability activists and advocates of universal design to describe what happens when a design change that was intended to serve people with disabilities is so broadly beneficial and widely accepted by the larger community that we forget its original purpose. So we take it for granted, essentially. It's just something that we all appreciate and enjoy. So as landscape architects, we strive to find exactly these kinds of simple and elegant solutions to really thorny problems, solutions that both welcome and benefit all. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ryan to speak more about landscape architecture.
All right, thanks, Jordan. So I've been tasked with describing landscape architecture in a few PowerPoint slides. So the way I've decided to do this is some illustrations that I created and kind of pairing them with some project photos and kind of walk you through the way I would best describe our profession. So I think our profession really centers around the intersection of place, people, and purpose. And as a designer of landscape architecture, you must understand and appreciate and respond to all of these in your work. Each of these three pillars are incredibly complex. They deal with complex relationships and countless overlapping and often interrelated goals. So, and oftentimes these can even be conflicting goals. So it's a very a complex relationship between each of these, what I would consider the pillars. And landscape architects have the task of prioritizing these in different projects without sacrificing the intent of the project. And that's a very difficult task. We're asked to both make, preserve, and enhance spaces. And we have to do so by listening to people, watching people carefully and intently, and advocating for people. And this is a really complex dance that we do. And this dance, which can be described as problem solving, deals with creativity. We'll talk about that in a moment, but also a host of other mindsets from math and art and science. And it's our job as landscape architects to find harmony in all of these. So I use this first slide to just describe kind of what these three pillars are and just the complexity and the interrelation of all of them. So this second slide is what I'm trying to illustrate here is just that our profession exists at this nexus or this intersection between the natural and built environments. And it's a really beautiful space because while we do work in each of these spheres are inspired by one another, they integrate with one another, and they collaborate with one another. And we're asked to design the built environment, and at the same time, we're asked to protect the natural environment. So this overlap creates this really complex and chaotic area in which we live as landscape architecture. That's not to say we don't do work outside of that overlap, but I think where we thrive is at that intersection and that overlap. And it requires all of those elements that I just mentioned in the previous slide to be successful. To really thrive in that overlap, you have to understand place, people, and purpose. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what we do as landscape architects, but I wanted to really articulate what I believe it takes to thrive as a landscape architect and not just exist. So There are a couple things. The first is communication. And when I say communication, I think this involves communication of all forms. Obviously not just verbal or written communication, but communication through the entire process of design. So communicating your intent with your client or your user, communicating across disciplines. We often serve as kind of an intermediary or an arbiter between different allied disciplines, communicating ideas effectively, and also communicating how to build and implement our ideas. So communication is really key. The next really thing that I think is critical to thrive is problem solving. And I put creative in parentheses here, but this is really difficult. And as landscape architecture, we're often taking on these really complex, wicked problems. And to succeed, you have to live on both sides of this edge that I've drawn on the page. This yellow line that I've drawn represents an edge. So at the same time, we must simultaneously think about how we can be practical and functional. And simultaneously, we must also think about how to live on the other side of this edge and be imaginative and innovative. So as you can see, the way I think the landscape architect accomplishes this is this stitching pattern that we use, where we wear these many hats and we move back and forth on both sides of this line and consider the complexity and kind of the interrelation of being both practical and innovative, or both functional and imaginative. So we wear the hats of scientist and psychologist and sociologist and engineer and artist and storyteller. And oftentimes we're asked to switch these hats and move back and forth and stitch this line together. So I would make the argument that living on one side of the line would not make you a successful landscape architecture. You really have to learn to not only balance the two, but exist on both sides simultaneously in a project. And the last piece I want to talk about is vision. We are inherently a design profession, so we are asked to visualize what yet does not exist oftentimes, and that is a tremendous responsibility, but also extremely exciting. And we have to see opportunities where currently there are constraints, and we have to sometimes when we do use our vision to see inequality, we have to think about how can we design a space that's more equitable, and we have to see we have to think about how our designs will impact future generations and impact and hopefully sustain despite how culture and society changes around them. So vision is incredibly important. I would say these three elements really together allow a landscape architecture not only to exist, but thrive. And then, it's not letting me, there we go. And then the last slide I want to share is just illustrates the breadth of our profession. And this is one of the things I love about our profession, but also one of the things that makes it extremely challenging is we have to think and act across these different systems of scale. So at the same time, within one project, we may have to consider the very micro scale of a microorganism in a soil, or down to the microscopic scale. We also have to think about macro scale. So we'll be considering thousands of acres or regional planning of an area. So we have to be able to think across these large systems of scale. And the other thing is we have to be able to consider intricate details of projects down to minute tolerances, all the way, and then at the same time, have to think and act through abstraction, and which often requires the release of that rigid structure of detail. So I've tried to draw on these kind of loopy intersecting lines, but ultimately this is kind of the way I picture our minds operating across these scales, not back and forth, but at the same time doing this beautiful dance across these different across these scale and systems. And I drew these runners because it often feels like in our projects, we're constantly shifting back and forth. We're never stationary. So in one project, you may be at the same time running over and thinking about something on the micro scale, but also having to abstract your mind and think about where an idea may go, how to pursue it further. So that's kind of my summary of the profession, and I think this will help prepare you as some of our guests here talk about the projects, just the complexity of thinking and acting and doing that is required by landscape architects. Thanks. I think you're still muted there.
There we go. Thank you so much, Ryan. And that was a really tall order to encapsulate what we do in a couple of slides. Thank you. You did a great job. And it's a great transition to the next point of discussion here is going to be exploring universal design and accessibility through teaching. So let me get started. Building off of Ryan's points about problem solving at a variety of scales, I'm going to talk briefly, come back again to accessibility before moving on to examples of some teaching and student work in the landscape architecture department here at University of Kentucky. And I'm going to start with the landmark law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. This passed in 1990 and secured a long and hard-won fight by activists to protect people with disabilities from discrimination, and it was modeled after 1964 Civil Rights Act. On the left, you can see a group of people with disabilities literally crawling up the steps of the US Capitol to draw support for this act. And on the right, you can see President Bush signing the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. It's a very broad and far-reaching law. It covers issues all the way from voting rights to parking, but I'm going to focus in on the 2010 standards for accessible design. And these standards give greater definition to the legally defined requirements for accessibility, focusing in on technical aspects of making the built environment accessible in state and local government facilities, as well as public accommodations and commercial facilities. So I have the privilege to teach our students in the landscape architecture program here at UK about these issues in a couple of classes. And I break these pretty technical, jargony standards down into individual components you see on the left that combine to create a more holistic system that landscape architects have to be knowledgeable about and be able to apply when designing outdoor spaces. So I'll start with some of the components. Slope is the flatness or steepness of the ground. We strive to keep slopes in landscapes as flat as possible while working within the constraints of existing site conditions. The vertical change of elevation or rise is divided by the horizontal distance. You probably remember this from 7th or 8th grade math, and that gives us the percentage of slope on the ground itself. So for people moving across a site, a slope of more than 5% feels steep. A gentle slope is somewhere in the range between 1% and 3%. And ADA standards require ramps for slopes that are greater than 5%. And then they'd say that a maximum, and they limit slopes to be a maximum of 8.33%. You all, I'm sure, are aware all about curb cuts and crosswalks. Of particular note on the right are the images that highlight the visual and tactile cues of striping, bright color, tactile warning strips that again ties back to that principle of legibility. You may not be as familiar with the concept of a raised crossing, often referred to as a speed table, because it both eliminates the need for curb cuts and it helps to reduce traffic speeds. I'm going to show you a little bit more on that later. Ramps, landings, and railings come into play when slopes get too steep, often providing an alternative to traversing stairs as well. And so when the slope of the ground exceeds 5%, you have to build a ramp. And this is a really important threshold for landscape architects, because if you have to build a ramp, you have to have a landing or a flat area at the top and bottom of it, and you have to have railings on either side. This is all for safety, assisting people who are traversing a difficult slope. There's also information in ADA about parking and entrances, because these are critical points of access to a site and potential buildings on the site. So ADA standards specify the location, the required numbers and dimensions of accessible parking spaces, as well as the access aisles for both cars and vans. And then also information about those critical distances, which again was one of the principles we talked about earlier for entrances. So someone can easily arrive, maneuver around, open a door, depending on their abilities. So at the site scale, getting back to the system, accessibility really begins with an accessible route that provides connections between accessible entries of a building and key points of arrival on a site that often are going to include parking spaces and passenger loading or drop-off zones, public transit, you can see a bus stop there in the image, public streets and sidewalks, and all of this must coincide with general circulation paths, because ultimately we're trying to create a sense of equity, and we don't want to, again, stigmatize nor separate. We want people of all abilities to have a common experience and ease of access to the site. So landscape architects intentionally and thoughtfully design accessible routes for sites by adding all of these components together, hopefully in a slightly more inspired and creative, engaging way than pictured here. So we're going to transition, and this brings me to some of my teaching experience here at UK and a couple of examples of student work. I teach a studio to our third-year undergraduate students, and it's a primarily technical course. Students have to quickly settle into a design concept, and they're going to develop a series of construction documents over the course of a semester. And I have chosen the last 4 years a site on campus for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's important for students to be able to visit the site and get a really good understanding and grounding in it, and then later revisit the site to both visualize and test design ideas. Campus sites also demonstrate that we have a living learning laboratory right here at our doorstep, which I think is really important for students. And they can imagine themselves and their campus community as site users or stakeholders, and we give them opportunities to learn from, engage with, and present to a diverse group of campus stakeholders as well as professionals within our community. So pictured here is the Reynolds building, and the project was titled Reynolds Reimagined. It's a former tobacco warehouse on the west edge of campus. It's going to be the future home of the College of Design's Architecture, Interiors, and Historic Preservation programs, as well as our department within the College of Ag, Food, and Environment. And so you can get a sense from the pictures, it has some very challenging existing conditions. It was never intended to be an educational building or one that was really welcoming. It was a warehouse, and it was primarily an industrial use. And students were charged with creating a welcoming, multi-purpose, multifunctional, accessible, sustainable landscape that reflects and connects to the work going on inside the building when we arrive there. This is a proposed grading plan. So this is one of those technical drawings that my students have to create, highlighting their innovative approach in orange to sustainably managing stormwater on site through a really nicely sculpted bioretention area. So again, those problem-solving skills. And then how do you help envision and help other people see your vision? So here's their rendered plan, and it's highlighting kind of the diverse range of plantings, as well as how the space is kind of interwoven with a series of accessible paths, elevated boardwalks, and observation decks. And all of these combine to create a really layered and highly immersive and engaging experience for visitors to the site that you can see in this technical section, and then also in this more illustrative section that they used in their final presentation. The next project I will share is focused on the historic core of UK's campus. If you work or are a student here, you're familiar with the Funkhauser building and the plaza in front of it. And you can see that it certainly has, with this really large monumental stair up to the first floor, up to the main floor of the building, it definitely has its challenges for accessibility. I had students use UK's web-based interactive mapping interface, which helped, it's designed to help students plan routes between classes and also just get a better sense of the geography of our campus. And so this route is connecting the Funkhauser building all the way to the Gatton Student Center. And it's 0.35 miles. It'll take you about 7 minutes to walk there. Some of you may not be familiar with this wonderful little button that you can click over here, highlighted in orange, and it says use accessible path. And so it's a great resource for campus community members or visitors with disabilities to help them navigate campus and understand where they can get into and out of buildings or park. And so with much of the historic fabric of our campus core predating ADA guidelines, you can imagine this is a challenge. So it's great to have this map. So you can see how that route between Funkhauser changed to be 0.44 miles and 8.8 minutes long. So the route's a little longer, takes a little longer, but not significantly so. The thing that the map doesn't communicate is the qualitative experience of that path. So here you can see that people with disabilities who are coming or going from Funkhauser must enter and exit through the back door. This was no one's intentional choice. It's more of a reflection of our evolving understanding of equity and access. And so we have lots of years of hindsight since this building was originally constructed, and we can now plainly see that it's not providing a pleasing or an equitable experience for people with disabilities. So my charge to students was to create a rich, accessible pedestrian experience that would enhance the site both experientially and visually. So in this student's project, I've highlighted the area where students focused on achieving that equitable point of access into the building, into Funkhauser. If you're familiar with campus, you know that people getting into that door on the eastern end of the building are going to encounter a staircase. So again, that sense of imagination and ability to have vision about spaces, we often have to suspend our sense of disbelief and help people imagine dramatically different possibilities. And that was certainly the case here. So here again, a technical grading plan. The student ensured that they met the proper accessible route, the slope and dimension guidelines I talked about, and connecting the accessible parking in the upper left to the accessible entry point in the lower left with the arrows. They lengthened the walkway a little bit, which meant they didn't have to create an actual legally defined ramp, which would have landing and railing requirements. So this approach, by thinking a little bit more critically about it, it would ultimately be probably a little bit less expensive. It places people closer to diverse bioretention plantings and enriches their experience and understanding of the ecological functioning of the site. Most importantly, it would make it easier and less strenuous to traverse for everybody. And so you can see that illustrated a little bit more at the top in the section the student drew for that site. Wrapping up these examples of student work, I wanted to share some inspiring images for how the university is creating a more accessible and inclusive campus. So here is an image of the elevated walk or the speed table along University Drive, and they have great signage. Striping could probably needs a little freshening up, but great signage, and now a lit pedestrian sign and a great place for students. And this actually connects to a really strong and generously sized pedestrian access that connects all the way from the 90 to the Jacob Science Building, excuse me. And then here, a more recent example of a really nicely detailed, really popular pedestrian bridge that links Patterson Drive to the Gatton Student Center. And this is a really critical and vital accessible link between Upper Campus and the Avenue of Champions, allowing people to enter into the building and use something like an elevator to change elevations and get down to that street level on the other side. So with this next section, I'm going to transition from hypothetical student work and UK's campus to some built projects I worked on in Virginia when I worked for a firm called SiteWorks that was founded by some mentors and friends, Pete O'Shea and Sarah Wilson. This first project shared a similar set of conditions to the Campus Crossroads project at the Funkhauser building. It transformed Wayland Hall, a residential hall on the campus of James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, into an innovative living, learning community. The back of the building, you can see in the upper right, the existing site was a classic back door, not a welcoming entry experience at all. This image highlights the accessible parking spaces in the lower right, the walkway and series of landings and ramps that navigate between and tie into a really challenging series of different building elevations along the backside of that building. The innovative site design turned these challenges into design opportunities, and we were able to knit together a really vibrant series of outdoor terraces with accessible ramps and inviting stairs. And all of these were connecting to reduced but more accessible parking, as well as a covered bike rack facility. You can see in the upper right side of the photograph. And those things encourage alternative transportation and fewer vehicles in the campus center. We also were able to create really strong connections between indoor and outdoor environments. And then at the same time, the really richly planted and carefully engineered site provided important functionality by sustainably managing stormwater on site and supported many more diverse and enriching human experiences, activities, and uses in what was essentially a parking lot behind the building. So now I'm going to transition to talk more specifically about playgrounds before I hand it off to Joe. You only have a little bit more of me, I promise. So Chapter 10 of the standards outlines special considerations for integrating accessibility into play areas. And honestly, many of the images and tables are enough to kind of bring tears, but they're really important effort to provide objectively equitable access to playgrounds for all kids. I've tried to simplify the information by breaking it down into 3 categories. Components can be an element that's intended to generate a specific opportunity for play, socialization, or learning. And play components can be manufactured or natural. They can be standalone, or they can be part of a bigger composite structure. And this list is just a starting point. There are many more. In the middle, elevations is basically a way of distinguishing how children access the different components. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then systems, which I kind of think of as the connective tissue and skin of the site. So to walk you through the first components, and I've highlighted and indicated the kind of play opportunities that these components provide. So you can see the metal bars providing a sliding opportunity, the wooden tunnel providing hiding, crawling along a cargo net, and then climbing over there along the tree stumps. And the goal with these standards is that for any child of any ability to access as many of the different play opportunities as possible. So that's why we distinguish between the different elevations. And so this refers to whether a playground component is approached and exited at grade, making it ground level, which is illustrated by the boy hiding under the wooden tunnel there, or if it's approached above or below grade. So above, or you had to step down into something, making it an elevated opportunity in either case, like the cargo net highlighting the little girl that's crawling across it. And last is the systems. And so you can see the linking elements is the cargo net there between the 2 wooden tunnels. You have the large mulch safety surface or surrounding the play elements or the different components. And then last but not least, that accessible route. It's a really strategic use of a more expensive material, cord and rubber play surface, to create that orange accessible route going underneath the tunnel. The bottom line here is that the guidelines are seeking to ensure children with disabilities are able to access a diversity of components provided in a play area. These are a bare minimum, and you should always try to exceed them wherever you can. Equally important is to foster socialization and interaction among children as much as possible. That integration is really key, because we've already talked about isolation of accessible elements does not meet the intended goal of inclusivity. So circling back to a couple of statistics, the statistics previously were about adults. These drill down into children. And so this is the 2019 American Community Survey, shows the prevalence of disabilities in children ranging from 0 to 17. The map on the left breaks down the percentage of children with a disability by state, and you can see Kentucky ranks high nationally, coming in at 5.9%, which is 1.6 percentage points higher than the national average of 4.3. On the right, the bar graph describes disability by type for children all across the US. And we're really most concerned with that gray bar in the middle, because that's for the children aged 5 to 14 who are really the primary playground users that we're designing for. The greatest proportion of children this age face cognitive impairments. You can see that highlighted in 1 at 4.4%, followed by vision, which comes in at 0.8%. And then mobility and hearing are tied for third at 0.6%. So really different than the adult statistics that we looked at previously. Unfortunately, they're not, I was unable to find data at the state level for these. Also thought it would be a good reminder here to remember that the ADA standards are really addressing the more visible disabilities such as mobility. So we see with childhood statistics that many of the disabilities children are facing are the less obvious and visible ones. And you're going to hear more about that from Joe a little bit later. So next, I'm going to share an example of a playground project in Charlottesville, Virginia. And this is a plan of McGuffey Park. And the accessible entrance is highlighted in the lower right-hand corner. The broad perimeter path supports equitable access and movement throughout the site. And we provided a variety of seating options. Benches flanking the paths, picnic tables, seat height walls were provided throughout, with more active playground located on the left-hand side of the image and the more passive and open gathering space and lawn on the right. We preserved as many trees as we could and planted many more, in addition to a really diverse palette of shrubs, perennials, and ground covers to stimulate the senses. We talked about that earlier, but also enrich the overall experience for everyone. So sorry for the image quality here, but here's just a close-up on the ramp there at the entry. And so you can see in the photograph, you have the curb cut with, the tactile warning strips. You can see the ramp and landing, and then another ramp to the top, which connects with the path. And you can see how you have to detail and specify that technically. Here is an example of the seating I mentioned, where we joined together multiple picnic tables and benches to make a more generous space for gathering and eating. And we left strategic gaps. You can see it kind of in the lower middle section of the image. We made gaps for people at the ends to make space for someone who might be visiting or wanting to engage in a wheelchair, so they have a place at the table. These images highlight a custom water feature, which was a real highlight to work on. And we had access to salvaged granite curbs from the city, and we used that as a material for that wall. And we worked with a custom concrete fabricator to create kind of a false floor, you can see in the image on the right, to the fountain that could support kids safely playing and splashing in that water. The concrete fabricator embedded rocks in the surface of the concrete, creating a really unique effect of the pool and water. And also it was a surface that the kids loved to touch and walk on and play in. And for the fountain, you can see also on the right, we wanted to create kind of a sheeting effect with the water at multiple heights. And so also the proximity to the adjacent path made it possible for someone in a wheelchair to potentially reach out and touch or be splashed by the water, enriching the sensory experience for everyone and really integrating that experience into the site. Before I hand things off to Joe, I wanted to share a couple of final images from McGuffey, kind of tying back into playgrounds and how ADA specifies those. So this picture shows the park on opening day, and you can see the many play opportunities on the site with rocking, sliding, spinning, and climbing. And the surface that we chose and used for that site was an engineered wood fiber. It's a special kind of mulch that kind of knits together to provide a stable surface that meets the ADA's technical standards, but it does require regular maintenance in order to maintain a smooth and regular surface. And you'll hear more a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of that when Joe takes over. And last, I wanted to share this image. It's a perspective drawn by my former boss, Pete, and it's from a different iteration of the park's design, but I wanted to include it here because it highlights the responsibility we have as designers of public spaces to represent the fullness and diversity of the communities that we are designing these spaces both with and for. And Joe has a tremendous wealth of experience to share with you on that front with the public parks here in Lexington, and I will hand it off to him.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Jordan, for that lead in. And I'll get to my screen share. Honored to be here with you all. Can you see my screen now?
Not quite yet, Joe.
Okay, how about now?
Oh, we can see it now.
Okay, all right. So I want to start off by introducing our agency, the Division of Parks and Rec, and then go into showing some of the things we've incorporated for inclusivity and ADA accessibility in our playgrounds here in Lexington. Our mission is to build community and enrich life through parks, programs, and play. And we're a nationally accredited agency through CAPRA, the Commission for Accreditation for Parks and Rec Agencies, and one of less than 200 nationwide. Our planning and design office has 3 licensed landscape architects. And our agency has been committed to inclusion since our first therapeutic recreation programs began in 1955. So we have a history of inclusion. Lexington is one of only 3 parks and recreation agencies in Kentucky with staff and programs dedicated to serving individuals with disabilities, and is the only agency with a certified therapeutic recreation specialist managing the programs. This commitment for equity is agency-wide, including permeating our the culture of our planning and design office here, which administers the capital improvement plan for all of our 100+ city parks. So what we know and are excited to share is that within all of our design projects, there are opportunities to improve access, promote inclusion, and create an equitable experience for all visitors. And as Jordan and Ryan have talked about, we keep those goals in mind as designers, but specifically when designing path of travel and parking, our destinations within parks, our ball fields, playgrounds, community centers, and dog parks, and so on. Drinking fountains and restrooms for comfort and dignity, to program sites and equipment for adaptive recreation.